Jim Axelrod, how you doing?
Hey, Scotty, how you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Where are you coming to us from?
So I'm in my home in Montclair, New Jersey, which is a wonderful place to live.
Is it really? I've been thinking about moving. I kind of, my like sort of middle long-term plan is I live in Brooklyn right now.
Yeah, that's the rule, when you live in Brooklyn, and then when you want a backyard, you come out to Montclair.
My thing is I want to be able to take my shoes off and put my feet in grass. That's like a big thing because I feel like I think there's just a certain amount of humanity that gives you that when you're just walking on concrete all day. And I'm not really a spiritual person, but there's something about just stepping on grass that just it takes you down to earth, literally,
Yeah, pros and cons, I guess, wherever you live. But there's a hip sort of restaurant scene. There's a nice, literally, it's half a Park Slope ends up out in Montclair. But it's a wonderful place to live, and I kind of agree with you. I like the smell of grass. That's for sure.
And I'm just kidding, to be honest. I love the city. I've only been here about 6, maybe 7 years, but I kind of like having that separation of like I can go to the city, but I don't have to be in the city,
Yeah. Well, we listen, pre-pandemic, it would take sometimes, it's like 19 miles from my house to the CBS Broadcast Center at 524 West 57th Street. So in the old days, you could lock up in traffic and it could take you an hour and a half door to door. Not so bad anymore. But, I used to go in sometimes early Saturday morning. You could go in 20, 25 minutes. And so, just the other day, we wanted to go see a film on the Upper West Side. And we left at 5, slid into the film at 6. Film's over at 7:30. We're home by 8:30. Like, that's kind of cool.
I have a similar thing coming from Brooklyn because I take the C train straight up because I work on the 5:30 side of the broadcast center, and sometimes I'll get there in like 35 minutes, and then some days someone decides to punch someone on the train, and then I'm there now an hour and 45 minutes later.
Right. Right. I always say, like New York would be a great place to live if no one wanted to live there, because everything would be easier, but that's not the case. You got 8 million people you're navigating, and sometimes they punch each other on the subway, and it screws up your commute, right?
Yep, exactly. So wait, you live in Montclair now, but you grew up not far from there, right? Highland Park, right?
Yeah, I grew up about 30 miles south of here, in the most wonderful town, Highland Park, New Jersey, 1 square mile, very diverse place, great public school system, a lot of Rutgers influence, Rutgers professors. Kids, and so the school system was great. But then you get into broadcasting, and as you know, at least back then, it was sort of like playing minor league baseball. You had to go from market to market to market. So I think I graduated school. I taught school for a couple of years in New Orleans and Philadelphia, and then I lived in I lived in Bangor, Maine, to Utica, New York, to Syracuse, New York, to Raleigh, North Carolina, to Miami, Florida, to Dallas, Texas, up to New York, down to Washington, up to New York. So I now live 30 miles from where I grew up, but hasn't been a linear progression. I didn't just go 30 miles north. I've been around.
What did your parents do when you were growing up?
So my dad was a lawyer, a personal injury lawyer, lived in the courtroom, maverick courtroom presence. He was an amazing trial attorney. I still run into people who always want to tell me a Bob Axelrod story, and I always love to listen to him. He's been gone for 23 years now. My mom, who just lives up the street from me still, 0.6 of a mile up the road, was a PhD in social work and had a therapist practice. So some interesting dinner time conversation around the Axelrod dinner table. That's for sure.
And I know you ended up going for college. You ended up going for history, but like when you were young, what were your like early passions or hobbies?
Well, it's funny. I talk with my wife all the time about did I sort of end up. I never thought that I was going to spend 34 years as a broadcast journalist. I grew up in the house listening to stories at the dinner table about trying cases, and I always thought I'd probably when I was a little kid, who doesn't want to go to work with their dad? But I think, and I was sports crazy too. So I spent a lot of time following the Knicks and the Yankees and the Giants, and it's like a million other kids in New Jersey. So a very traditional background, and I never really though had sort of the light go on about so I want to do this or I want to do that. I was I was actually in a PhD program to become a history professor, and it was 1988, and I was supposed to be doing a lot of research, and instead I was sort of insatiable in watching coverage of the Bush Dukakis presidential race, and I thought to myself, wait a minute. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be reading page after page after page about 100 years ago. And instead, all I'm doing is watching the news coverage of this presidential race. So I thought maybe I need to get out of what I'm doing and try the news business. And so that was 1988. And here we are.
Did you have any inkling before you were getting your PhD that might be of interest to you, or was it just like, did it blindside you?
I mean, I always like politics. I thought I wanted to get into this business to cover politics. I got a chance to do that. Spent 3 years at the White House covering the end of the George W. Bush presidency. It's funny. I got into the business because I was watching George H.W. on television, and then I ended up covering his son at the White House. But interestingly enough, along the way, and I think for people who are trying to put it together, what do I want to do, and what is the criteria I should use to decide what it is I want to do. For me, it's always about what fits. What's a good fit for your passions, for your personality. And while I thought I was drawn to politics, once I actually got involved and was swimming in that pool, I was like, you know what? It doesn't have. It's politics, and great political reporters are amazing and important. And honestly, the cornerstone of the democracy is the capacity to ask questions of the people and hold the people in power accountable. But for me, the stories that are most meaningful are not about Washington, D.C. They're about connections between people outside of Washington, D.C. I didn't find that out until I was well into my career, until I was already at the White House. So it's a constant to me, finding any kind of professional happiness is a matter of asking yourself, what is it that you love most to do, and find a way to fit that into some sort of professional role. And it may involve saying, gee, I thought I wanted to do X for 20 years. Turns out what I really love is Y.
And so you first ended up going to Cornell, right? That was where you got your
Yeah,
bachelor's?
I did. I thought, history was at that point. It's funny. I just read an article this week about how liberal arts majors, English majors in particular, are greatly reduced. No one's majoring in English anymore. And I assume other humanities sort of are following that trend. I was a history major. I was a history graduate student. I thought it was a great way to be educated, teaches you to think, teaches you to write, teaches you how to approach the acquisition of information. I mean, you can't open a history store, so it's not directly related to how you're going to get a job. But for me, I just thought, you know what? Let me master. You can learn the skills required to be a decent broadcaster on the job,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't learn how to think.
Yeah,
If you know what I mean.
I'm always like I always learn my absolute best about anything when I just kind of dive in, feet first, just kind of go for it, because I like part of the reason that this show I do now, and I've said this a million times on here, is that the reason that I do it live is because I really had no experience really interviewing people. There's a massively loud ambulance going outside right now.
That's okay.
It's the charm of New
I
York.
can't hear it.
Okay.
I can't hear. Believe me, the number of times I've been in an interview and I hear the ambulance go by, and the sound man's always, about to wrestle me to the ground. I'm like, I don't think people can really hear it the way you think they can. So I can't hear this one.
Okay.
But to your point, Scotty, I think the key to interviewing, and I think that's something you probably know instinctively, you got two ears and one mouth. All right. So use them proportionately. The number of people who don't listen is astounding. And the key to interviewing is listening. Very few people do that.
Mhm.
And That and have a question. If I hear one more person say, "So talk to me about your trip to the store." No, ask a question. The route you took to the store. Why did you choose A instead of B? Like, it makes me nuts when people are like, "So talk to me about." No, 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 no. Don't be lazy. Ask a question.
Or you know what, the one that, and I think I've had a good track record that in, I think this is the 36th episode. I don't think I've ever phrased a question of what was it like blank. And that drives me up a wall when I hear that.
It's funny. I try never to ask or say, "So how did it feel?" Because that always seems a little bit like a crutch of a question. But sometimes it's what you want to know, right? Like, so like this really weird, crazy thing happened. What did that feel like? And you try to phrase it in different ways, but sometimes there's no other way to do it than to say, "How did that feel?"
A really good way I had it phrased to me, I think it was like a year ago. I was interviewing to work with Gail King. And I had already worked at mornings, but I was speaking with her, and we are talking about how I like to interview people, and she said you have the real questions, and then she says it's like a house. You have the foundation, you have like the nuts and
Always,
bolts question that you kind
always.
of found it, and then from there you can expand on it. And that was a really kind of breakthrough way of me to view it, you know?
I think that's right. And she's, obviously a master interviewer. I also think that it's okay to, if you have big interviews, to role play them. It's okay to write down questions as long as you're not reading them and then not listening to the answer. I've seen a lot of big names, and they'll be like interviewing the question and they'll say, "So what happened then?" And then the answer might be, "Oh, then the person broke into my house and they killed my whole family." So what did you like to do for summer vacation? And you know what I mean? It's like, are you listening? So, Gail's right. You have the unlock. I mean, whatever Gail says when it comes to interviewing, I would just do that because she is the master. But I guess the point is, there's a lot more technique to it. I think you have to have a conversation, right? Like you have to,
Hmm.
and you have to establish that sense of trust, but you have to always in your question, it needs to be with those questions are in service to a piece of information that you want to get to. And most interviews come down to a certain point. You may have set the table, you may have made them feel comfortable, you may have made them feel safe, but at some point, you're going to have to ask a question, especially if it's adversarial and hard. And then you just look them right in the eye and ask.
Hmm.
But be in command of your facts and know where you're going and structure the thing. The more preparation you do in an interview, the better off you'll be. I
I
don't care what your personality is.
I also find that I like, just in general, when I hear people speak in any type of recorded interview, I like when not everything has to be a transition. You know, it's speaking of that, this, I
Mm-hmm.
like sometimes someone says something, and the best way to feed off of it is to just
Mm-hmm.
punch them with another question. You don't always have to make it some
Absolutely.
silky smooth transition, because sometimes that gets people to like kind of open up more because you're not always trying to make everything be so pre-produced, you know?
I think that's how you got to be nimble, and you have to trust yourself and your ability to have a conversation enough to go, "I know what the third question was supposed to be in my mind, but that's not where it's headed. So let's trust this and go with it." So I think, look, I mean, luck is the residue of design, always. And the harder you work, the luckier you get. So do all the prep work and understand things. I can tell you've done your research, right? Like, and then wing it, then have a conversation, but it's an informed conversation. It's like, put it this way. I once heard a very, 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 very famous interviewer say, "I don't like to read the book before I interview the author." And I'm thinking to myself, no, you're just lazy, because you have to read the book. You have to.
Hmm.
And then once you read the book, I just interviewed Pamela Anderson. Okay. And she had a book come out and a documentary. And of course, I read the book. And of course, I watched the documentary, because how am I going to have an intelligent conversation with her about her life, which is its own amazingly complex story? Like, how am I going to do that without having a mastery of how she has decided to tell that story? So somebody says, "I don't read the book because I want to maintain spontaneity in the conversation." You're like, "Nah, come on, read the book, watch the doc, and then you can be even more spontaneous, because you've poured with concrete, right? Then trust yourself to sort of paint on top of that, because you've got this very strong foundation, and you can improv and can be as jazzy as you want, as long as you're working off a foundation of concrete.
And now, directly in contrast to what I said, I'm gonna launch straight back. So you're in college, you graduate, you get your
Yep.
master's
Yep.
1989, and then you go straight to Maine, correct?
Yeah. So I taught school after undergrad, 2 years in New Orleans, 1 year in Philadelphia. I went up to Providence at Brown University and was in this PhD program. And then I decided after a year, I'd get my master's, and I couldn't shake this thing of broadcast journalism, but I didn't know anything about it. I didn't have the foggiest. I didn't go to a school that had a program in journalism. So I decided I would go up to this. When you don't have any background, sometimes you have to find places that are going to hire people with no background. So they tend not to maybe be. I'm grateful for the places I worked, but I can't say that they were, put it this way. The second place I worked, I went up to this place in Maine, and it was for like 8 weeks, got on my resume, and then I found a job in Utica, New York. And they were paying me enough. I think I got 2 checks a month for $300. And one of those, my rent was $300. So I had $300 to live on for the month. And I was like anchoring the 6 o'clock news. I was barely able to buy enough tuna fish to fill my cupboards, but I was learning so much. I was learning the business. It was great. They had one camera. The camera had a blue spot burned in the tube. The morning photographer had to meet the afternoon photographer in a parking lot to hand over the one camera the TV station had. But I got to do I had to write 7 stories a day. Like, I learned all the skills that I would have learned had I studied broadcast journalism for several years. So I did that for a year, and I was lucky enough to get hired in Syracuse, New York. Learned at that station, WSTM in Syracuse, New York, great TV station. There were great people there, and I started to learn. I think it's very important to find mentors. There's a guy there, an anchorman named John Nicholson, who had been in the business for years and taught me how to write and taught me how to think about storytelling and taught me that this is a craft. This is something to be taken very seriously. And I did, and I was lucky enough after a couple of years to get hired at WRAL in Raleigh, North Carolina, which I think is one of the nation's great TV stations. And it was owned by a wonderful man, Jim Goodman, and he made sure that that station had all of the technology it needed. There was a helicopter on the roof. There was a satellite truck out back. I learned how to do TV and journalism there and covered the North Carolina General Assembly and Raleigh City Hall. And it was like the best 3 years anybody could have possibly imagined. And from there, I was lucky. CBS picked me up and sent me to Miami. And I worked with as good a hard news producer as there ever has been in this business, a guy named Larry Doyle, legend. He could feed a signal, from a hurricane place where there was no cell service. He could get the video back, with a coconut shell and rubber band. I mean, he was the most inventive kind of logistical genius ever. And he taught me so much. My career all along has been informed by guys and women who had been doing it for a long time and sort of kept helping me understand the different layers of craftsmanship that is involved in telling a story.
How do you, when you're going back like that, when you're going right on the air, having, you say in Maine, then to WUTR in Utica and Syracuse, how do you prep for something like that, having had no one tell you ahead of time? Did you try to talk before your first broadcast, or did you just kind of watch stuff and just go into it?
Well, listen, this is a great question and something that I think is important for people to understand, especially in the broadcasting business. There is always this rush, to get ahead, to jump up, to climb the ladder. And there is, somebody catches lightning in a bottle, and you always see somebody very young, very polished, and they're on the air. And that's great. That's wonderful. There's been some wonderful people who've done this at very high levels at a very young age. I say, make your mistakes and leave them in Utica, leave them in Bangor, I have a tape of an interview I did with a pro golfer named Wayne Levy in 1990. I couldn't have been more horrible. Like I couldn't. I kept looking here to talk to him, and this camera was taking me. So I turned back here, and then this camera would take me, and I couldn't get it right. If you watch the tape, it's like the most hysterical 5 minutes of TV that ever. You know what? I left it in Utica, and it never happened again. Like learn the wisdom in whatever you do. I don't care what you do. I don't care if you're an accountant. I don't care if you're trying cases. The wisdom is in the scar tissue. Always. The mistakes are the best thing that you can make because they teach you. So how did I do it? I screwed up a lot. I made a lot of mistakes, but then I'd leave them where I was, and I would take the lessons, the knowledge that I learned through making those mistakes to the next level. And so I got started just because, I was sort of a little desperate. I was 26. I had no broadcasting background, and I just dove in, but I dove in Bangor, Maine. Like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen, right? Like, so you screw up. Like that's tuition, right?
Yeah.
And it was great. So I still screw up, but I don't screw up as much. And more importantly, most of my major ones that helped me develop a skill set, they're back in Utica.
Would you go back and watch the footage right after, especially early on? I mean, now as well, but especially when you're green like that. Were you watching everything back, or were you just kind of memorizing it and saying, I didn't like how I did this?
The worst thing that could happen to you would be on a Friday afternoon, like you screw up your last live shot of the week, and you're driving home and you're redoing the live shot into the windshield, like as you drive, and you're nailing it perfectly every time. So why did you screw up when it mattered? And then till you can get to Monday and do another live shot. I do remember, and it's like another thing to keep in mind, like, you'd go with all the young reporters and you'd all sit around and talk about what your dreams were and where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do. And I would go in the station on Saturdays and watch what I had done that week. Or I would go in and make dubs to send out to news directors to try to build relationships and ask people to critique my tapes and hopefully meet somebody who could tell me, hey, you know what, buddy, like you need to be doing this, 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 and this. But I'd be the only one in there on Saturdays and Sundays watching my stuff. So yes, I watched mistakes like incessantly to figure out what I had done wrong and what I could do right the next time.
Do you think your education in history really helped separate you from other local anchors because you had so much knowledge on, the past?
I would love, like I was hoping, but no, it was a clean break. I wish that there had been some advantage. There were so many people who were so much better than I was in terms of the TV part of it, especially people who had come out of schools where they were trained in how to do it. My voice was awful. I'm in North Carolina. They sent me to a voice coach because I sounded like I was from North Jersey. So I was horrible on camera and on television. That 10,000 hours thing is real, and repetition is the mother of skill. In TV, you learn who you are by doing it. You learn who you are on camera. It's like this weird inherent contradiction. It takes a gazillion hours to become who you actually are, right? Like that's the thing. You want to be in an interview situation. We're talking about interviews. You want to be good in an interview? Be yourself. But you know how hard that process is to fight through all the cloaks of things people put on to like try to be a certain person. And it's like, no, the key is to understand who you are and then be comfortable enough with that so that when you go in and you're interviewing somebody who's like, a big name, you're just yourself. Like that's the key, because it's an intimate medium and it can always sniff out phonies, or I would hope it could sniff out phonies. So, yeah, the answer is there's no answer. There's no substitute. Just do it for a while and figure it out. Look, we're talking about Gail, right? The best there ever was, like the best. You know how long? How many years? Ask her sometime. Like
she was a local for like 18 years, I think, right?
You know how important that is in terms of building a skill set. And so, what's the thing everybody always says? Like she's exactly who she is on TV. as when you're right.
Yeah, I can
And
completely
that's
attest
not
to
always
that.
the case. That's not always the
I
case.
can
But
also
I
attest
think
to that. I know some people who
right,
aren't.
exactly. So that's why, yes, sometimes you catch lightning in a bottle and you're where you want it to be by the time you're 28 or 29. Most of the time, I think you've cheated yourself from a very important process, which is spend 5, 6, 7, 10 years working on a skill set that you then own. And when you finally get to where you sort of get an opportunity, you have a very refined sense of who you are and how you tell a story. And that becomes distinctive. And that's how Scotty tells the story. There should be only one way. When you do one of your stories or when I'm doing one of my stories, I love for people that was an Axelrod story. Like that's always the goal.
Mhm.
But that happens only as a result of understanding what you think effective storytelling technique is and then applying it, which you can only do if you've been doing it for a number of years.
So by the time CBS picks you up, which is in the mid 90s,
Yeah.
do you think that you had honed the kind of the majority of your, and I don't want to say, personality, like we said, people are the same, are different off air than they are
Yeah.
on camera, but had you had kind of refined those major flaws by the time you had gotten picked up?
I mean, I think I refined enough so that I could go to a flood or I could go to a fire. I could tell people what was going on in terms of I could do a live shot. It's funny, you get in front of the White House and maybe it's a little more pressure. Remember the first time I did a live shot in front of the White House, everything went black because I felt this incredible pressure. And I literally was like, and I was there, I was fine. I don't think you could tell watching, but I just remember thinking, I've done live shots from Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
I've done live shots from Afghanistan. Like, why is standing in front of the White House the one that's causing me? I think it was the enormity of the responsibility. And by the way, like not everybody, that doesn't happen to everybody. It happened to me, like because it meant so much. And that was a whole nother thing. That didn't happen. I wasn't there until I'd been with CBS for 10 years before I went to the White House. So the answer is like the basics. I think I was a network level sort of flood and fires guy when I started or soon after, because I was able to work with this guy, Larry Doyle, who helped refine me and several others. I went to Dallas. There was a great correspondent there by the name of Bob McNamara who could write like nobody's business. And I watched him closely. And there was a guy named Bernie Goldberg in Miami. Watched him, everything, stole blindly from him. But we used to talk for hours about storytelling. And so I began to get a sense of how to tell a story, but that didn't become anything I felt like I had. I mean, you never master it. I haven't mastered it yet. Like, I've been at CBS 27 years and I haven't mastered anything in terms of like, I still hope there's several more levels,
Mm-hmm.
but you begin to get a sense, I would say, of like you elevate at different points. It took me a long time to gain a sense of, that's when I watch stories now, I feel like, okay, that's how I wanted to do it. If I watch stories from 10 years ago, sometimes it's like, God, I'd love another shot at that,
But that's kind of, I think that's what keeps it. If you were able to, every time you did an episode, did a piece, did an interview, if every time you went, that was amazing, I'm really good at this, you'd be done in 2 years because there'd be no interest. There'd be nothing pushing you.
You'd also be a jerk.
You would.
Right.
And I mean, there are people I'm sure think that way.
Yeah, it's funny. I let me put it to you this way. In 2005, I interviewed Paul McCartney. Okay, we did a piece, a Sunday morning story, and it was amazing. It was amazing. I look at that piece now. I'm like, I would do such a better job, right? So that was what 18 years ago, right? 2000, yeah, 18 years ago.
Yeah.
All right. Last month, I interviewed Bruce Springsteen, and it was such a different experience. Why? Mostly for one reason: 18 years. Like there were 18 years of learning, 18 years of skills being refined, 18 years of me watching other people and thinking, so maybe you should try that or that. 18 years of growing into yourself and getting comfortable in your own skin. I guess my point, Scotty, is the process should never stop of looking in the mirror, watching your stuff, seeing how you come across, learning how to prepare. Like, you never reach a point where you're like, okay, got it down. Because at that point, you're just mailing it in. And that's not challenging and it's not fulfilling.
And the thing about the way I see it is because I have a very simple job. I don't have a network breathing down my back. The only person breathing down my back is me. Besides some technical stuff, I can basically do what I want. So whenever I go, I really flub that up. I think to myself, I could have so many more things going. I really need to work on that because I could have so many other stresses. And the thing that I heard you talk about before that absolutely blows my mind because I'm sitting in my comfortable room right now, okay? I got my lights, I got this, I got the makeup, all that. I heard you talk about a story where you're about to go over to the Euphrates going into Baghdad. This is like '03,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're in the Hummer and the corporal says, "We're just going to go fast because the Iraqis, their weaponry is not too good. So they're not going to they probably won't hit us." And then that Hummer breaks down. I can't even imagine having to go through that and then
Yeah.
having to be a television personality.
Well,
How do you process someone saying that? Do you really think about someone saying we're gonna blast through this gunfire, or do you just kind of black it out and say I have a job to do? I can't really be thinking about that.
so that was 20 years ago. 20 years ago this month, actually. And I will say that it's an entirely unique experience. It's not like it's happened. I mean, I've had other situations where you're like, in some sort of threatening environment. We were in Afghanistan, right after 9/11, before the American troops were there, and that was a little hairy. But the trip over the bridge in Iraq was, sort of unique in terms of the Humvee then breaking down and thinking to yourself, wow, this isn't sort of how I envisioned this all going. So different people react. The driver, who was a brilliant CBS cameraman for years, a combat cameraman named Mario Di Carvalho, who had been in the Portuguese Special Forces and was very, very used to dealing with situations. He had covered really bad. He'd been in bad places. And he knew how to handle himself. I did not have that sort of experience, so I reacted in a way of, I was in the fetal in the back seat, wondering if my wife was 7 months pregnant at home, and like all of a sudden it's like, maybe I should have thought about this before I put my hand up for this assignment. Like all kinds of stuff goes through your mind. I mean, yes, it's easy in some cases to then, I mean, I had to do the story at the end of the day, but I guess my answer to your question is, know why you're doing what you're doing, in any career. Know what you're doing, know what the consequences could be, and you should always be aware of sort of what the possibilities are. People, that was a traumatic event. I'm not going to sit here and be like, I shook it off and went on with. No, it took a piece out of me for years. Like, I'm not some kind of tough guy. I don't come from a long line of brave people. Like, it scared the hell out of me. And it had consequences that I had to work through for a long time after that. So, there are different people. Again, know what your goals are, know what your dreams are, know what the prices you're willing to pay, know what you're not willing to do. Again, it's the exercise that runs in a parallel track to other questions in your life. Professionally, there's this: what do you want to do? What are your limits? What are your goals? What are your dreams? But there's a personal component to that too.
Were you going
And you should always be asking yourself, both professionally and personally, like, where do I want to get to?
were you going back and forth between the States and Iraq, or were you just there for one stint and then you came back?
Yeah, so we went in February before the war started. We went out to Kuwait, hung out for a while, sort of waiting. Then we went out a couple weeks before to prepare, and then we went and covered the invasion over the berm. I was with the 3rd Infantry Division, the 1st Brigade. I was embedded with them. Wonderful people. I had never really seen what it was like. Certainly the technology didn't exist to broadcast live from a battlefield before. It was nuts. And there was no preparation in certain ways. Made some very good friends, had some amazing, indelible experiences. I went back to Iraq 8 years later in 2011. I was in the last Humvee out of Iraq for the United States military. So I was in on the invasion, and then I was in the last Humvee out, which was an amazing experience in its own way. Looking out the back, I was with a photographer by the name of Tony Furlow, still works for CBS News, among the most talented photographers of his generation, certainly that you'll ever meet. And I remember we were looking out the back window, and there was just nothing behind us but road. And you also knew, as the last Humvee, kind of had a target on you if anybody wanted to make a statement. So I felt like we were in a mobile bullseye.
Was there any amount of PTSD from having such a crazy experience when you were there, 8 years prior?
Well, yeah, I didn't think there was or that there would be, but it was I don't want to be. Look, there are people like Charlie Daggett for CBS News is amazing guy, and he's intrepid. There's all kinds of people. Elizabeth Palmer, she's amazing. She is absolutely as brave as it gets. The London Bureau for CBS News has had so many people that have been just phenomenal producers, correspondents, photographers. There's a guy named Andy Stevenson who's just photographer, started as sound guy. He's as brave as it gets. I'm not sure I have that gene. I've done it, but it took a big piece out of me. Again, it's very personal, and different people deal with it in different ways.
I remember Charlie. I think he was in the Ukraine like the first or second week of the war,
Yep.
maybe even earlier than that, and he was there for months on end.
Yes, you're like sleeping in the mud. You're picking dirt out of your teeth. It's a very demanding, draining, difficult kind of work, and very few people can do it at the level that our folks in the London Bureau and elsewhere around the world can do it. It's something, I've seen people over the years I've watched, and I've had a lot of people you look at, you're like, yeah, I could probably do that. There's people I look at, my colleagues, no way. I couldn't do what they do in a million years. In a million years. Elizabeth Palmer, Charlie Daggett, I can't do what they do.
But now the whole time you're in Baghdad, right? You get through all of this treacherous stuff. Like you said, you're sleeping in the mud, that kind of thing. This is not the most glorious thing. But then a couple years later, you become the chief White House correspondent. And at that point, sometime during that stint, you say, I've done all these things. I'm doing what I can't even believe I'm here, but I'm miserable.
Yeah.
So what is it about? Do you think it was almost the fact that you've experienced all of these incredibly unique, difficult things, like going and reporting on the war in Iraq, that kind of added up to that? Because it's almost like, where do I go from that? This is almost too cushy in a way.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I guess I'd answer the question this way. All those things were done to climb a ladder, right? Get up the rungs of a ladder. But what would trigger me often into understanding, I'm in these places. I'm flying around the world with the president. I've covered war. I've scaled certain parts of the broadcast ladder. It's all wonderful stuff. But the pieces that would make me well up with emotion, with connection, weren't about. I remember I was doing a piece once about a program that was run with a maximum security prison where inmates, lifers, were breaking horses. It was like a prison almost rodeo thing. And then kids with cerebral palsy would come in, and these prisoners would put the kids on a horse that the prisoners had wild, like Mustangs, that they had broken. And the horses would take these kids. There's something, I don't know if you've ever seen this before. It was one of the craziest things I've ever seen. Kids with cerebral palsy get on the back of a horse, and a lot of their it's a very moving thing to see. They sort of get in rhythm with the horse, and it's just a sort of a therapeutic program. And it was, you would see these sometimes convicted murderers very much moved by their ability to help a kid with a physical challenge sort of get this therapeutic experience. Watching that, it's like, like, and I find myself welling up. Connect. Those are the stories I want to tell, right? Like, so I get to keep my hand in. I do investigative stuff for CBS News. That's great. That's as hard news as there is, and shining a big light on important issues that matter. We're doing something right now on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I get to do 48-hour stories, incredible crime, solving crimes, but pieces that I do mostly for Sunday Morning that have to do with the connection of people. Like, those are the ones for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the most important. And at the point where I was sort of climbing the ladder after the war in the White House, the work itself wasn't what I loved the most, but it was the external validation of, oh, you're the chief White House correspondent. Oh, you went and covered the war. Oh, like, you realize that that's not getting it done at the end of the way. What's filling up your heart? Like, that's always a question I think people should be asking, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what's filling up your heart? And the work I was doing wasn't filling up my heart that way. So now I get to do work that sort of does that on a more regular basis.
Do those heartwarming, happier ending stories, do they kind of help balance out when you have to dig really deep into a story that
Sure,
isn't so happy?
sure.
I think the first time I met you was when you were doing the 48 hours piece for Eric Smith, who he was it like 28
Mm-hmm.
years ago, had murdered a 4-year-old
Mm-hmm.
boy, and you were
Mm-hmm.
talking to the family of that boy. It's now 28 later, he's
Mm-hmm.
getting released. How do you separate yourself from doing that and not on your own become depressed just because you're so involved in such a sad story?
Well, in that case, you realize that you're telling the story for the family, which is a very serious obligation that you have. So you want to be very present in talking to those folks, and your emotion or your despair or there's no time or room that will get in the way of telling these people's story. So from a professional perspective, if I'm fortunate enough to sit down and be able to tell these people's stories, if that's something they're trusting me enough to sit and let me ask questions about that, I mean, that's an obligation I have, right? To take very seriously. My emotion is inconsequential in a way. I want to connect with those folks. I want to feel what they're feeling. I want to be able to articulate it and share it with our audience. And I think I can do that in a way that is going to effectively tell their story. But you can't allow your own emotion to sort of corrupt that experience. It's like my emotion isn't more important than articulating what these folks are feeling about this story that is unfolding. But yes, so like, that's hard. I'm not driving home like, hey, another day at the office. That was great. It's like, oh my God, how do they go on? I have kids. Like, if something happened to one of my kids, like, how would I go on? Like, yes, of course, there's some sort of fallout. And yes, that's balanced by, if you're sitting doing a story. I don't know. Last year we did a piece on the Doobie Brothers for Sunday Morning. All right. And that's like, talking about the origins of some of my favorite songs in the world. I'm like, wow, it's a great way to make a living. I'm talking to Pat Simmons about the solo for China Grove. Like, as a teenager, I had 1,000 questions for this guy, watching him on, some late night TV show playing. And now I'm actually sitting across from him and asking her Paul McCartney or Bruce Springsteen. Like, I love being able to like talk to that's a great way to make a living. Yes. Sometimes on an emotional level, that compensates somewhat for the despair you're also in touch with by telling the story of some of the folks that maybe the 48 hours stories brings you in touch with.
Do you have to kind of put yourself in the place of the people in those kind of situations, like the Eric Smith situation? If someone was coming to me and talking to me and this was my family, how would I want them to portray it? Because you obviously have to put on an entertaining show. If people don't want to watch it, you can't, there's no money to supply to do it. But do you ever say like, I could do it this way, but I, on a human level, wouldn't want someone to talk about my story like this. I wouldn't want them to kind of not glorify it, but produce it to the point where they're just trying to get a good show and not connect with me and really appreciate, what I'm going through.
Yeah, I don't know. I may sound like a dinosaur, but I still believe that the best thing you can do is if you're talking to parents who've lost a kid, right? Like, with as much empathy as you can muster, with as much sensitivity, with as much understanding. Look, sometimes people want to talk. They want to express things. They want the memory of a kid to be at the end of that story you're talking about. These folks wanted to talk about the favorite ice cream flavor of their son. Like, sometimes they want to talk about their kids. Sometimes they want to say something about the criminal. Sometimes, like, it's not my job to do anything other than to, in a sensitive, empathic manner, conversation, make sure I understand what these folks want to communicate and sort of elicit that. But there's no upside ever in, using somebody's pain for, some kind of entertainment. I don't, for me, it's like, I still trust in the human connection. Like, that's the basis for everything. And I think, that maybe that's, I don't know, is that old fashioned? Then sign me up for old fashioned, because that's really all I care about as a storyteller.
I mean, that's the one thing that kind of ties together media now and 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 40 years ago. Is how does it connect to the person watching it? How do the people on the screen, how do they connect? That's the one constant. All this, the technology, the topics, that'll all change, but that's kind of the underlying thing.
I hope
that
so,
connects
buddy. I hope so. I mean, again, I don't know. And are we training people to understand that? Like, you do me a favor, because you seem to have a natural instinct for it. Like, you just keep going and doing what you're doing, and do it the way you seem to be doing it. And then influence as many people in your generation as you can, because I think you need, I mean, these are the best conversations, right? Like, what's the goal? Where's your destination? And then how are you going to get there? And what is the skill set required to get you there? Like, I'm with you.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, life's about human connection. Stories are about human connection. Journalism should be about human connection. And if we lose that, and if you allow sensationalism to overlook good, there's nothing that is stronger or more powerful than human connection. So it will generate all those ratings that we all know we need. I'm not like naive. Like, we want stuff to be watched. But what people have right now in our culture, the way it is now, there's holes, a lot of holes in a lot of people's hearts. So we can fill them with stories done, and not just happy stories, not just, everybody gets a candy bar at the end. That's you can just do stories that are hard, difficult, sad, but they involve connection, and people will watch, because there is a appetite, a hunger, especially now, to be reminded of the magic and power of human connection.
And that's why you are the Jim Axelrod. Jim, on that note, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, listen, I'm a big admirer of what you're doing. I love your style. Keep at it. I'm sure you're going to all the places you want to get to. Just do me a favor and keep asking yourself, now, where is it I want to get to?
I will do that. I promise.
All right, buddy. Thanks for having
Jim,
me.
Thank you
really
so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone who watched. We will be live next week with Randy Brecker, which is amazing. So thank you, guys. I'll see you later.
Wow.